Welcome back to the Dean Obeidallah Show. Right now, very happy to welcome Brendan Duke to the show, Senior Director for Economic Policy at Center for American Progress. Prior to joining American Progress, as Staff Director of the U.S. Senate Finance Subcommittee on Taxation, and was a Senior Policy Advisor at the White House National Economic Council. Brendan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Dean.
Sure, my friend. So let's give people an inflation 101, how we got here, right after COVID, why there's still inflation now, does greedflation actually play a role, and all of that. So right now, I think people remember inflation was like over 9% in June 2022. That was right when we're coming out of COVID. We heard everything about supply chain and it seemed very real. Now we're down to 3.3%. But let's go back. How did we get to 9.1%, which was the highest in 30 or 40 years?
Yeah, I think it was a surprise to everybody. I'm in my 30s. I never saw anything like that beforehand. It's something I talked to my parents about. But, high inflation was not something I ever expected to see. But I also didn't expect to spend a year on my couch and in my bed working, right? So
Right.
a lot of strange stuff has happened over the last few years. So inflation is the increase in prices between 2 years or 2 months, however you measure it, but it's the growth in prices, right? So when inflation goes down, prices still go up, they just go up less quickly. And I think the key thing is that just 2020 was a really weird year. A lot of weird stuff happened. We had millions of people essentially fired from their jobs because you couldn't safely go to a restaurant, go to a movie theater, etc. Those people sometimes found other jobs, sometimes were just waiting for the economy to open back up. And what happened was, because of the rapid recovery we had in the beginning of 2021, when we got shots in arms, et cetera, you can shut down the economy pretty quickly, but getting it to start back up is actually a process. And so we found out that supply chains were a big part of what happened, that basically the economy took a little bit of time to wake back up. And so when we've analyzed it, about 80% of the growth of inflation during that really high period, that 9% period, was supply chains. It was cargo ships outside of Los Angeles and Long Beach trying to dock to put stuff, to get all the
Right.
stuff that people wanted in. It was workers, essentially getting hired who move our economy along, et cetera. It was all just that kind of just getting back to normal stuff. And so now we've gone from 9% back down to 3%. And when we've analyzed that, again, most of that reduction is explainable from supply chains. And then again, what I haven't mentioned is right when we were beginning, I think, to feel like we were getting, our sea legs, so to speak, out of COVID, we had the Russia-Ukraine war. That caused price of oil, price of commodities,
Mhm.
all to spike up, back up again. And so that was just another, I think, surprise. So I think it was those two things. It was just emerging from something we haven't experienced in 100 years, which is this pandemic that really just caused our economy to shut down. It's really hard to start back up. And then the Russia-Ukraine war just put these shocks into the system. And now that they've been unwinding, we're in a much better place now.
So where does, and I ask this objectively, not because Republicans like to call it Biden inflation, but I just want people to understand when government does increase spending and there's more money out there, how that can impact inflation, and can it?
Yeah, it certainly can. So I think if it's basically deficits
Right.
can cause inflation. That, basically when the government is spending more money than it takes in, that can increase inflation. And that's definitely a concern, and that's why the Fed raises interest rates, right? To, offset that. And that's why you can't just grow the economy by just increasing deficits in an unlimited fashion, right?
Sure.
So, that's kind of your speed limit on that. So certainly deficits can play a role there. And it's possible, they played some small role, but again, 80% of it is explained by supply chains. That when, we ran these massive deficits during COVID, essentially Americans didn't have a place to spend it all. And I think a big part of the picture too is that we've seen inflation go up across the world. It's happening in the UK,
Right.
happening in Canada, happening in Italy, all these countries that do not have a president named Joseph Robinette Biden. We've seen inflation go up in them too. So I think that's like that's I think more evidence that it was just this kind of waking back up and these, broken supply chains that really drove that. But certainly, deficits can contribute to inflation. I think in this case, it was a very minor role.
And did we contribute to inflation because we were that pent up demand, the YOLO idea of you only live once, which I saw a lot. Now people are like, oh, but the debt stays apparently forever. You might only live once. And now I think people are starting to slow down just a little bit on restaurant spending. You kind of see those numbers. But did that and the fact that you couldn't spend money, so people were unintentionally saving money. Some, we don't forget, we also got government money. I think a couple of times we got a few $1,000s from the government, and some people had companies that got some money as well. And then everything opens up and we start spending. Were we contributing to higher prices, or that did not matter in the beginning? That again was 80% supply chain type of
So
causes.
I actually think that a big part of the way behavior influenced inflation actually was before the YOLO moment, which was the board moment,
Okay.
where people bought a bunch of stuff on Amazon. Is essentially what happened. Is that normally we spend most of our money on services, but during the pandemic, people got bored. I think the quintessential example is instead of going to spin class, people bought Pelotons, right?
Right.
And so those Pelotons
Yeah.
needed to come through, and that caused the cost, that caused the price of things like Pelotons to go up, right? Because again, we move from an economy where people go out and do stuff to an economy where people just are shut-ins. And then, again, then people go out and do stuff. All those transitions, I think had a cost and were a problem for the economy. So, I think something really interesting about it is actually in most years over the last like 30 years, we've actually seen the price of goods decline. That
Hmm.
is the normal, especially durable goods. That is the normal pattern. It's services, it's healthcare, it's housing, it's childcare, all those things going up is the reason we normally have something like 2% inflation. But normally goods actually go down. But actually during the pandemic, that pattern reversed itself. The price of goods actually went up because people were buying stuff.
Right.
Another example is, people weren't buying at restaurants, people were buying at grocery stores, all of those things. So I think, and that was actually a big part of the supply chain crunch that, it's not like the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, where we get most of, actually where we get almost half of the imports coming into this country via ship. It's not like they could just expand like overnight. Wouldn't have
Right.
made sense, especially because we were going to go back, right? So that was, again, it was that transition where everybody's just buying a bunch of stuff, frankly, from Asia, for a year, and then they stop, but that surge and reduction certainly contributed to inflation.
And it's a great example you give Peloton, because Peloton shoots up, its stock price goes way up, and now it's really
Yeah,
barely alive as a company. And
right,
they were like the phenomenon. And Zoom, but Zoom has had some residual benefits because it's become part of our lives, a lot of us,
right,
where you can't make a meeting. It's no longer a big deal. Like, oh, let's just
yep,
Zoom it. Even
right,
TV appearances for me, like when I do cable news,
yep.
like I can't come in. Like, okay, we'll just do by Zoom. Or I'm trying to, Brendan Duke, Senior Director for Economic Policy at American Progress. So can you explain for people how the Federal Reserve works in terms of trying to reduce inflation? They really raise interest rates uh, quarter after quarter after quarter. Now the debate, are they going to start lowering it? Maybe in the fall we might see that. But just so people understand, when you raise interest rates, why would it have an impact on pushing down inflation, at least theoretically, economically?
Yeah, I think that's something that confuses a lot of people because
Yeah,
it actually, higher interest rates mean higher costs, right? Isn't that
right.
first of all, when we measure inflation, we actually don't normally include things like mortgages, for example. Those are actually excluded even from our housing measures of inflation. So that does not enter in. And then the second point is, uh, demand can play a role in inflation, right? And so basically, people spending more money than they have can obviously can contribute to inflation. So by raising interest rates, the Federal Reserve basically can prevent people from spending money. People are less likely to buy a house, they're less likely to borrow on their credit card, they're less likely to buy a new car on finance.
Mm-hmm.
Businesses are less likely to expand
Right.
because they frequently borrow to do that, and when the cost of credit goes up, they do that less. And so the challenge the Fed has when it does this, when it's trying to restrain inflation, is how do you, it's a little like chemotherapy, how do you raise it and slow the economy down without pushing it into a recession is the challenge that happened. That's why a year and a half ago, most, 99, there's a 99% chance or 100% chance of a recession, according to Bloomberg Economics, because basically too much chemo, right, was what they figured. And the economy actually proved to be more resilient than we thought. So basically, the way the Fed tries to control inflation is by holding down demand.
It's very interesting, like how that works out just from I guess a macroeconomic point of view, like the idea we're going to raise interest rates. And in the beginning, I didn't see anything. And then you start seeing home sales grind to a halt
Yep.
because your monthly payment, when you add what your principal will be plus now a much higher interest rate, it becomes unaffordable for many people. It's also why people aren't selling, because they're locked into really nice, great interest rates on their mortgages. And they look out there like, oh my God, if I sell now, I'm going to be buying, I'll get less. So, and I guess for people who are real investors or whatever, there'll be a point where the interest rates start coming down. And if they can jump in then, at some point, it'll probably mean home values will go up, just
Yep.
the actual cost, because you can charge higher because your interest rate payments are lower.
Yep.
And SiriusXM, we're so dependent on cars, not completely, but
Oh,
car
yeah.
sales. So
Of
this kind of
course.
stuff is like, you got to stop raising the interest rate. You got to cut it so we can get raises. Like that's,
Right.
it's a macroeconomic thing affecting very micro ways, like really impacting. So we see that just when you start reading about these things, like, oh, that's how it works. So look, where now the consumer prices raised 3.3% in May compared to a year ago. So it's slight easing. It's still stuck. The Fed wants 2%. Can you tell us why is 2% a magic number? Why 2% inflation and the Fed has been fine with it, and why we have to get there? Why is not 2.5% okay?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, funny enough, it's actually probably more like 2.3. We actually have two measures of inflation, the
Okay.
consumer price index, which is what came out this week at 3.3, and then this thing that the Department of Commerce puts out, the personal consumption expenditures, PCE price
Okay.
index. That's actually what the Fed targets at 2%. It's generally a little lower than CPI. So 2% PC inflation is something like 2.3% CPI inflation. So it's a number that was just made up by central banks kind of around the world. And I think there's two reasons for it. I mean, I think there's really one main reason for that. The main reason for that is that prices going down sounds great, but can destroy an economy. We saw that in the Great Depression,
Mm-hmm.
actually. And I mean, this makes sense. If you figure that prices this month are higher than next month and are going to be higher the next month, well, I may as well not buy anything. I may as well wait for those savings, right? That is going to destroy an economy, right? Because people just don't spend money because they are waiting for those price reductions to happen. So and so going below zero is very bad. And obviously we can't precisely target where
Right.
we are. The Fed is not 2.0000. They're okay with 2.1, 2.2, 1.8, 1.9. And so you want a target that kind of is well away from that danger zone of deflation, because once you get stuck in that deflationary cycle, it's really hard to get out.
It's interesting that inflation actually has a benefit.
Yes.
And so why is it being so, and let's talk about what we're living through right now. And I think, the pain for people when we talk on the show is that it's 3.3% consumer price increase, but that's on top of the 8% before,
Yeah.
or the 7% before. And it's like, and now everyone's got their anecdotal thing. Like for me, it's a half a gallon of milk at Whole Foods is $7.
Yeah.
And you're like, does that come with something?
Yeah.
$7? Like, do you get another gallon of milk with it? Or like I tell people the bagel and butter indicator. I live in Manhattan. It's been $2.20 forever. Before COVID, one of the bagel stores raised their prices and put a note up apologizing why they had to raise it because and they put up 20 cents more. Now it's 3.50. The same
Yep.
store, no apology anymore. I'm like,
Yep.
are your costs that high, or are you just making great amount of profit on this? So what can you share about why the stubbornness of this now, and why is it not just keeps falling each month? And oh, we're at 2.2%. We're fine again.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way, and it makes sense. I mean, milk is the example I turn to. I have a 2-year-old. We buy a crazy amount of milk, and yeah, it just feels like crazy that, I go in for a couple half gallons of milk and it's $20, right?
Yeah.
Um, so, first of all, again, for that same reason, we do not actually want prices to fall for
Hmm.
the reason that that can lead to a depression. And actually, a big part of it is 70% of our economy is wages, right? And the reason why actually the thing is we know that wages adjusted for inflation are higher now than they were in 2019,
Right.
which is great news, right? People are doing better than they were before the pandemic. But that money comes from somewhere, right? That money goes somewhere. And so your bagel shop, for example, I bet they are not paying their workers the same wage that they were paying 4 years ago. And that obviously makes it very difficult. And the cream cheese they're buying, people make that,
Right.
and so that all just
And we
kind
have a
of
$15 minimum wage now in New York City, which we didn't have before.
right,
And that's
which
another
I
thing.
which I think is great,
Hmm.
and
Yeah, I agree.
but in a lot of cases, they're paying more than that now. And again, that's why, if you're trying to get it back down to you said 250,
220. It was like two and a
220.
quarter.
I know if
Went
you're
to
trying to get
250
it
one
down
time.
to
I'm like, what is wrong with you? What do you think? I'm made of money? How
I
dare
know.
you? It's a butter and bagel.
I know, but if you try to get it down there, the only way the company's going to be able to do that is either go out of business or pay their workers less. That's just
Yeah,
how. That's just
I
how.
understand.
Yeah.
No, that's a good point. I'm chatting with Brendan Duke, Senior Director for Economic Policy at Center for American Progress. So, do you, is there anything like the Fed right now? Everything you see, if you watch CNBC, is that it looks like the Fed later this year, we might see one cut
Yeah.
and one interest rate. Is there any concern there could be a spike in inflation? Like, are things now kind of calmer and we're moving downwards? And would you expect inflation? Keep the policy. Let's keep them the same thing, and then we'll talk about what Trump's proposal is, which
Yeah.
would raise inflation. But things the way they are now with the Biden economic policy, do you see inflation continuing to trend downwards?
So, I'd be a lot richer if I were able to predict these things.
Sure.
But I think a really important thing is obviously, inflation's down 60% from its height right now. That's good news. But one of the important things is how broad the inflation is. And by that I mean in how many different categories. Back when it was 9%, prices were going up everywhere. They were going up in bagels. They were going up in health. They were going up in every sort of good you can buy. They were just going up across the board, right? That's much harder. That's a very concerning picture. When we look at why, we're at 2%, why instead of at 2%, we're at 3.3%. When you kind of decompose that missing, that 1.3% too high, 2/3 of it is housing and one
Wow.
third of it is auto insurance, right? So it's really only these two categories that are driving that. So I think that's the somewhat good news. Obviously, a lot of everybody lives in a home. A lot of people have cars. That's not to say that there's no pain there, but it's not across the board, right? And so that I think means that, we're getting to these small stories. With housing, there are a lot of issues, and happy to talk about this, in how you measure it. Especially most Americans own a home. So, and as I said, interest costs don't pay into it. So they have to do these methodological quirks on that. And then, there's issues about the freshness of the data of housing. So a
Mhm.
lot of people think that housing, you know, it's clearly important, but maybe the data are a little bit stale and aren't actually quite freshly capturing everything. And then auto insurance, is an interesting thing. Some of it might just be that, a lot of data show people are worse drivers than before the
Or
pandemic.
maybe a
People are,
car. I wonder if cars get older, if you would think for collision it would go down because the value, because people, what I'm getting at, people are holding their cars longer
yep.
because interest rates are much higher now.
Well,
But
yeah, but the price of cars still shot up.
oh,
Cars are more expensive than they were 20, and so that's a big part of it
yeah.
too, is that the underlying asset that you're insuring is more valuable. So the insurance has to go up. And it happens with something of a lag, right? So insurance is going to stop going up in price after auto stop going up in price. And then again, a lot more accidents, a lot more road rage, a lot of other aspects of that too.
And what about, so I mentioned at the outset that, President Biden had a new commercial on inflation. He didn't mention greedflation, but he has mentioned corporate greed in different interviews recently. While people like Senator Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, Democrat running for reelection, and Sherrod Brown, just point blank greedflation. And I know it plays well for politics. I'm trying to get your answer objectively. Does corporate greed, is it playing a role in this, what we're seeing?
So I think inflation is determined by macroeconomic factors. And corporations are always greedy. That's just kind of
Sure.
what we expect. I think a lot of the frustration people are feeling is that, we've had, these companies enjoying, we've had this supply chain easing, right? So companies' costs have, stopped going up, have leveled off. And there's still this question about whether they're actually passing on those savings to consumers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think like to think competitive pressure, things like that will cause them to do that. And we've actually gotten, some recent news of Target, Walmart, et cetera,
Right.
like cutting prices. So that might, be some of the beginning of them passing that on to consumers. I think, whether it, plays a role in inflation is, I think, a really complicated topic. There's various industries where there's corporate concentration. And so, makes it companies don't face a strong incentive to reduce prices. So I think those things are definitely, worth looking at to some extent. When there's inflation, it's either going to wages and profits, and a lot of it is going to profits. I think, various tools, and, President Biden's proposed, antitrust actions. He's actually done a lot of great work on junk fees. So there's a lot of movement on those parts. But hopefully, I think that, as we're going to see as inflation eases, we're on a good path of inflation. In some sense, a lot of that problem will go away because I think we're going to go back down to 2% over, the next year or so.
That's good. And, President Biden with the Inflation Reduction Act, little things contribute to you having less out of pocket. Insulin being capped at $35 for seniors helps seniors so they don't have to spend, they can spend that money elsewhere and they don't feel the pain of inflation, whatever it might be able to negotiate down the price for Medicare for certain prescription drugs. Now we're beginning that process. That's important. So let's talk about, the Republicans are calling it Biden inflation, blah, blah, blah. Trump has proposed a 60% tariff on goods from China, but specifically a 10% tariff on all imported goods. And what would be the real world impact on that?
I mean, first, it's the craziest policy proposal I've ever come across, right? In that we have challenges with China. I don't see why putting taxes on strawberries imported from Mexico or Brazilian coffee like helps us with China, right? Especially in
Right.
the United States. We import 99% of our coffee. We actually only produce, 1% of our coffee. One state produces coffee. Do you know which state that is?
I'm going to guess California, but I'm probably wrong. I mean,
Hawaii.
wow. Oh,
Yeah,
it's a
ton of
very
coffee.
interesting tropical
Yeah,
place that you need temperature, very interesting
right.
climate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. You can't just like there will, sorry to break it to you, there will never be a coffee plantation in Manhattan. Um,
Wow. Well, I get an espresso. They send me the stuff. So I'm
yeah,
all
right.
right.
Yeah,
So from the
right. That
store.
works. Okay.
But no, that's interesting. So
Right.
I didn't know that. So, but getting back to everything that's all imported and a
Yeah.
10% tax on all of it, what Trump is
Just add
proposing.
10% to everything. So, we crunch the numbers, and that 10% tax on everything entering the country would cost a typical family $1,500 annually. Again, about something like almost $100 of it is food, about $200 of it is cars, clothing, all these things, so I think again, like it doesn't make much sense. Again, like, China, there are issues that we need to confront there. But, 60% of the stuff we import comes from Canada, Mexico, the EU, the UK, Japan, and South Korea. Like, I don't see why we need to raise prices on those things. Those are friendly countries. Those are our allies. We should be working with them to confront China instead of taxing everything we import from them. So I think the key thing is that this would, again, supercharge inflation. So, the consumer price index came in at 3.3% for May. It would have been 4.8% if we had adopted this, right? So, and inflation actually, inflation went down over the last year. It would actually be higher than it was a year ago if we had adopted this. So
Right.
it's a directly inflationary policy. that would cost families. I mean, I just think it's crazy that, everybody's complaining about the price of groceries and coffee, tea, strawberries in winter, avocados, berries. Again, I have a toddler. She loves berries.
Right.
All that stuff would go up in price. And I don't really understand why, except he would use the revenue to cut taxes for the wealthy. And that's another part of it is one goes up, one goes down. So it would actually raise a decent amount of revenue, but he would use it to offset his tax cuts for wealthy people and corporations.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw the reporting. So Trump spoke yesterday at the Business Roundtable.
Yeah.
And on CNBC, Andrew Ross Sorkin was saying that the business leaders were stunned by the meandering of Trump, and things didn't make that much sense. And I guess they have not seen him in person in a while. I tell people, no one wants to watch his rallies, but if you watch a little bit, we cover it
Yeah.
here and there. It's not, something's wrong. To be blunt,
Yeah.
I'm not a doctor, but something's wrong. And they laughed when he said, and we're not going to tax tips anymore. And the business executives, that's like saying, oh, we're not going to tax your wages anymore. That's a great, say that to whatever you want, but good luck.
I mean, all of a sudden, Jamie Dimon's going to work for tips.
I know exactly. That's why I said SiriusXM, you pay me in tips. Every
Yeah.
day I'll come in after a show and the boss will hand me an envelope.
Right.
Good job today. It was all tips. Like no one else pay taxes. We all would love that, but you can't function as a society that way.
Right.
We have to contribute our fair share. So, all right. Well, Brendan, I so appreciate you coming on here and going a little long and breaking this down for us. And I look forward to chatting with you as more business economic policies come out that President Biden advocate, and we're going to hear others from Trump, so you can make sense of it. So hopefully you'll come back on and, as we get later into the summer or early fall.
This was really fun. Thanks for having me on, Dean.
Thanks, Brendan. Have a great weekend.